One of these people that Daniel just referenced, who will go unnamed, is a senior U.S. intelligence operative going back several decades. And when he talked to Jeff Steinberg a couple of weeks ago, he said, let's assume we stop the war. However, if Obama is reelected, then this nation will not survive another year or two. What we're looking at here is a civilizational crisis which is caused not merely by the evil of oligarchism, by the evil invocation of power by this oligarchy, but by the effect of that oligarchical principle on the mind of the population. That what we're looking at is the enemy known as popular opinion. And I want to situate this discussion from the standpoint of the effect of that popular opinion on the minds of everyone in this room, perhaps to a lesser extent than the minds of the people walking by outside. But that this popular opinion, otherwise known as prevailing stupidity, is the enemy, is the evil which we have to overcome, which we have to reverse, which a destruction of mind has been imposed over generations. And you look at young people outside, each generation has been more and more stupid, more and more besotted with various forms of ideology which cripple the capacity to think and to act at a moment of such existential crisis. Of course, it's exactly the magnitude of this crisis which gives us the basis on which we can revolutionize the thinking of Americans and of leaders internationally in such a way that we overcome this and we have a very, very happy 21st century. Daniel referenced the Lyndon's intent and his intensifying campaign to attack the party system, which party system has been dominant in the country since Jefferson, since Jackson, and increasingly so. The nation, one could argue, and I'll argue, that the greatest discovery in universal physical principle in the history of statecraft is made by Franklin and company. That is, the principles on which the American Republic is founded, the principles on which the Republic is founded in the Declaration, in the Federalist Papers, which argue for a constitutional framework, in the Constitution, in Hamilton's reports on manufacture, public credit, national banking, is that we achieve the height of statecraft in human history. And it's the case that Washington did not intend a party system. Washington opposed the idea of such a party system. Washington was committed to a presidential system, which is embedded in the Constitution. For those of you who saw the press conference 3 weeks ago of Congressman Jones, Bruce Fein, Colonel Wilkerson, you will recall that they developed a constitutional framework for immediate action, where they emphasized that impeachment is put into the Constitution by Franklin because in this nation we do not want to kill the king or the president. We don't want a coup d'etat. We want a simple constitutional method or procedure by which to remove a president who becomes untrustworthy. Constitutional principle. That the question of declaration of war must be in the hands of the representatives of the people, of the House of Representatives, as opposed to a king. Since we were working against an empire ruled by a monarchy which sent young men into war repeatedly. This was not tolerable. But you had such constitutional principle which was the guidepost for the nation. I'll elaborate on this later, but what LaRouches does in 1977, 76, 77 through 83, around his principle called Strategic Defense Initiative, is to reestablish a functional presidency. even around this around Reagan. And that presidency consisted of leading scientists who came to understand the principle we call SDI, leading intelligence operatives, military personnel, politicians, and so on in many nations. That LaRouche succeeded in this period, 1977 to 83, in reestablishing a constitutional presidency and an international network of thinkers, of political fighters, which almost ended the Cold War at that point, almost created an unprecedented period of world economic development, scientific development as the basis for peace. That is a paradigm for what Lyndon is doing with the Friday Project. That is, he has begun as of 8 days ago, last night, over the next several Fridays, addressing those individuals within the U.S. institutions, the presidency as an institution, some people in Congress, people of conscience, people of courage in this nation and internationally, to replicate at a very advanced existential crisis, to replicate the process which succeeded when Reagan announced the SDI in 1983. So you want to situate what I'll put on the table here today. You want to situate LaRouche's method of making history, LaRouche's discovery of scientific principle, within the context of this existential moment where you have a crisis that can lead imminently, as most of you know, I think, can lead imminently to thermonuclear war and thermonuclear extinction, and/or a slightly slower process of world economic and ecological holocaust. So, in that context, the enemy that we're fighting, popular opinion, prevailing belief, stupidity. For example, on the question of nuclear war, what the man in the street says is, they would never do that. That could never happen. And the question was asked to Lyndon last week at the first of these webcasts. Or on the question of the two-party system. Well, I mean, that's all there is. You know, that's the way it is. You have to choose, therefore, the lesser of evils. It's one or the other. Or you only know what you can sense. That is, knowledge is your experience. How else would you derive knowledge? And other such idiotic beliefs, but predominant prevailing beliefs which constitute the disease of the culture. Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, in his Concordancia Catholica, argued for the idea of a nation, of a society based on consent of the governed. This begins the Republican idea, consent of the governed, which Americans are familiar with. But he at the same time posed the paradox that the governed constitute an infinite pool of fools. By and large, the governed are foolish. Leibniz posed the notion that we live in the best of all possible worlds. And yet, what we have is a history of civilizations which have died. And therefore, how could it be the best of all possible worlds if you have many, many societies throughout history which have risen and then fallen with horrifying consequences? The challenge is how to defeat stupidity, how to put the nation and humanity on the kind of path which Ben Franklin and company succeeded in doing. I mean, this stupidity, it's crucial to think this thing through, because what we're talking about is not just oligarchical enslavement of a population by spreading false axioms, false beliefs, idiotic beliefs, like the series of things I'd referenced and many more. How about the one in the economics? All you have to do to solve the problem is cut the spending and cut the taxes. And everything will work out, because we're spending too much and taxing too much and so on and so forth. That what you have is a kind of self-enslavement within the population. That is, by and large, people controlled by such popular belief, popular stupidity, hate the independent thinker who challenges them, hate the Promethean figure. We run into this all the time on the street and in our organizing in terms of people who are challenged by LaRouche and by LaRouche's co-thinkers and associates who go after their prevailing popular beliefs. But this is, if you want a future, then a successful future, if you want to overcome the breakdown in economic life, if you want to create a society which secures a better future for young people, then it is mandatory that you break through in these axiomatic beliefs which have led to the crisis in the first place. And to do that, you have to have a conception of a future. If you're just looking back, if your outlook is based on your experience and the array of sense perception, which we call experience in your lifetime, then if you project from that, you're essentially basing your projection of the future on some array of such sense data. But what if the prevailing beliefs are leading to doom? How do you overcome that? That's the subject on the table. Now, our work as an international philosophical association, political movement, scientific movement, is paradigmatic of those leaderships historically, like that around Ben Franklin, which challenge such prevailing belief and make scientific discovery of what we call universal principle in such a way as to provide an actual leadership, the potential for cognitive breakthrough in thinking, an actual creative leap in thinking by leading individuals within that society, and then around those individuals, many others. Around, for example, the 56 men who signed the Declaration, the small circle around Franklin prior to that, who in turn propagated ideas which were truthful as against the oligarchical tyranny of that period. The paradigm for this is Prometheus. That is, what we invoke in doing this is what we'll call the Promethean principle, where you have the tyrant pagan god Zeus, prototypical of oligarchism, of this rule by the wealthy few, the rule of some powerful class which enslaves humanity. And Prometheus challenges this Zeus tyranny, the tyranny of the pagan gods, by stealing the gift of the secret of fire from those gods. Why don't you got the first slide? Oh, Daniel, why don't you, yeah. This is the classical treatment of Prometheus. There are other treatments, as in Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound. This is the Prometheus Bound of Aeschylus. Go ahead.
What I did for mortals in their misery, hear now. At first mindless, I gave them mind and reason. What I say is not in censure of mankind, but showing you how all my gifts to them were guided by goodwill. In those days they had eyes, but sight was meaningless, heard sounds, but could not listen. All their length of life they passed like shapes and dreams, confused and purposeless. Of brick-built, sun-warmed houses or of carpentry, they had no notion. Lived in holes, like swarms of ants, or deep in sunless caverns, knew no certain way to mark up winter, or flowery spring, or fruitful summer. Their every act was without knowledge, till I came. I taught them to determine when stars rise or set, a difficult art. Number, the primary science I invented for them. and how to set down words in writing, the all-remembering skill, mother of many arts. I was the first to harness beasts under yoke, with trace or saddle as man's slaves, to take man's place under the heaviest burdens. Put the horse to the chariot, made him obey the rein, and be an ornament to wealth, greatness. No one before me discovered the sailor's wagon, flax, winged craft, and rode the seas. Such tools and skills I found for men.
Anyone here know what happened to Prometheus?
They probably killed him. No, they tied him to a big rock in chains. And let's see, they had this nice bird sit and devour his guts.
He was chained to a rock virtually for eternity, with his liver eaten out every day by an eagle. The liver would regenerate and they'd eat it out again. But this was the punishment that the gods imposed on Prometheus for daring to take the science described here, the array of sciences, science of numbers, science of astronomy, and so on, and the more fundamental science of cognition, of teaching to mankind, of making accessible to mankind a process of endless concept formation. Plato talks about hypothesis and the development of higher hypothesis. That is an idea, a more truthful idea, which overturns the prior. And then the underlying process, hypothesizing the higher hypothesis. This is what Prometheus is accessing, is making available to mankind. And for that, the Olympian gods, Zeus and company, will attempt to destroy him. This is the power of human creativity. That is, if you look at human society, what you see as distinguished from the beasts is the use of fire. You will see, going way back, indications archaeologically of fire as the means by which man advances society. And therefore Aeschylus chooses in identifying this Promethean principle. Prometheus taking the secret of fire and propagating it. But more fundamentally, the idea of human creativity, which is the essence of human freedom. What we are working for, what we've got to see over the immediate period, is an insurrection of genius, an insurrection of free men and free minds who challenge the predominant stupidity, these predominant beliefs which are destroying society, which will lead us to doom. The problem you run into is typified by the Hamlet principle. That is, you have in Shakespeare's Hamlet the prince whose father, the king, is murdered by his uncle. The uncle marries his mother. And Hamlet is the heir to the throne, the rightful heir to the throne, who has to solve the problem of providing justice for the people of Denmark who are facing this injustice, evil within, and an invading army from without. And so that brings us to the famous Hamlet soliloquy. Hamlet?
I'll do my best. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the pressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, an enterprise of great pitch and moment. With this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Soft you now, the fair Ophelia, nymph in thy horizons, be all my sins remembered.
So Hamlet knows that he has a choice, to be or not to be, to take one action or not, to take one action or another, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them. He has that choice. What he chooses is to retreat in the face of the challenge, if you will, an existential challenge for himself and for his nation, for his people. And he proceeds then to indicate his fear. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and so on, the spurns. What happened to Prometheus when he took action to challenge the establishment, to challenge the ruling elite, the tyranny? By contrast, Hamlet says, the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns, unfamiliar territory. One does not know when one acts in a Promethean fashion against injustice, against evil. One does not know the path that will unfold. And he says, from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all. And thus the native hue of resolution, intention to act on behalf of mankind, the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. An enterprise of great pitch and moment. With this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Hamlet's lying. Conscience does make cowards of us all. Nope. Had that been the case, then we wouldn't be here. If all of humanity, if you had such cowardice dominating all of society, then the advances in knowledge, in science, in statecraft, and in economy, which have led to the world line of progress, which have created the world line of progress, this would not have happened. He's lying. He's cowarding out, which is, I would suggest, predominant within this stupid popular opinion that we're fighting. What motivates Prometheus is a quality that many would associate with Christ, a quality which the Greeks called agape, of love of humanity for the sake of God, of love of truth, of love of classical beauty. What Paul talks about in Corinthians 1:13, faith, hope, and charity, or agape, or love. That motivates Prometheus, love for mankind. And human freedom is a function of the necessity for progress, that is, man must act out of love for all of mankind, out of love for God, out of love for man. Hamlet chooses not to do this. And therein you see the two principles, the two competing principles. It is the case that at such moments as this, at such moments of existential crisis as we have today, where the danger to each of us, where the danger to mankind is of a unbearable nature, at such moments you have the greatest possibility of the emergence of genius, of the emergence of revolutionary transformation, as we see in the case of LaRouches. What I want to show you is, I guess this is just the audio, is that, the what? Okay. In 1973, a few miles up the road, Lyndon LaRouche began a class series entitled Beyond Psychoanalysis at Columbia. I was there. And I want to play for you the first minutes. I think the first minutes are a crucial section of that first class. Okay. He's reading that. Okay.
During a period of reaction which occurred among British intellectuals in the wake of the French Revolution, there was an attempt to explain creativity in art as being something which occurred within art itself, as independent of political movements of that time. In rebuttal of this, Shelley wrote an essay, one of his several important essays, and I'll refer to another one later tonight, entitled In Defense of Poetry. And I shall read a section from the conclusion of that, which is a thesis from which we shall work to provide a setting for the purpose of this program. The literature of England, an energetic development of which has ever preceded or accompanied a great and free development of the national will, has arisen, as it were, from a new birth. In spite of the low-thoughted envy which would undervalue contemporary merit, our own will be a memorable age in intellectual achievements, and we live among such philosophers and poets as surpass beyond comparison any who have appeared since the last national struggle for civil and religious liberty. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The persons in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated on the throne of their own soul. It is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled with the electric life which burns within their words. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit. And they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations, for it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age.
It cuts off, there's a final section. It goes on, poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Poets like Aeschylus or like Shakespeare, who develop ideas, call them metaphor, as in the Promethean principle or the Hamlet principle. We all have had in the last few weeks, many people here have had the pleasure of hearing a series of classes. Last week, Lainey Rubenstein's class on Quincy Adams. 2 weeks ago, Daniel's class on Plato and metaphor, focus on the Theaetetus of Plato. Previous week, Michelle's class on Bach. And what you have here, the subject of all of this, and the subject which I'm developing, is this Promethean agapic quality of mind, of intention, by a genius, by a poetic genius, who invokes poetry properly defined, poetry in the sense that you can capture an idea by juxtaposing different images, different thoughts. You can create a higher idea, which is theretofore unknown. You're generating a new concept in a process of, hopefully, endless concept formation. What you have with LaRouche is an individual who arguably is the greatest of such poets and philosophers and scientists in history. Lynn has an advantage, which is he comes after the other ones. So that if you go back to Aeschylus and Plato in that period, or all the way up through Leibniz and Franklin, through Bach and Beethoven, Einstein, Planck and Köhler, etc., is that Lynn has done the work over his 90 years to assimilate in his mind the unique discoveries, the decisive discoveries of such discoverers, of such thinkers, of the artists and the poets and the scientists and the philosophers, so on throughout history. And he's conceptualized a higher idea, which is the primacy of human reason, if you will, man as the crown of creation, insofar as human reason is in harmony with the lawful ordering of that creation, of the physical universe. What I want to do is, as we come to unfold that idea, is give you something of a handle prior to you reading this, if you haven't already. This is his 1988 autobiography. It gives you some handle on how this all happened, of how this guy came to develop such quality of genius and courage by which we have established a national and international leadership, a network of reason, which is capable of accomplishing the miracle that is demanded, that is required now. I mean, let's be frank. For us to win will be miraculous. But for us to be here discussing this today is already miraculous. Some of you know what this movement and LaRouche personally have been through. They chained Prometheus to the rock for a long time, virtually for eternity. However, Prometheus had a certain quality. The word means foresight, foreknowledge. So he had a further secret, which created a big problem for Zeus. Prometheus conveyed to Zeus, look, Zeus, I know that you are doomed. And Zeus knew that this guy Prometheus had this quality of foresight. So he was really, he had a rough time with this. Go to Shelley here. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower, the most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. To work a beneficial change in opinion. Right? Take this rotten popular opinion in which people are enslaved and self-enslaved because the population is quite committed to go along to get along. Right? You've all heard this. The Congress goes along to get along. The political parties, people are in the political parties, and there's no commitment to truth-seeking within political parties. That's not what the parties are about. Parties are about getting elected. How do you get elected? Well, you go along to get along, and you say what the population, which has by and large been rendered stupid, that which that stupefied population will support. And that two-party system perpetuates the crisis, prevents any resolution to the crisis because you have a system preventing a cognitive solution, a creative breakthrough, shared by leaders and some portion of that population. The system itself militates, the oligarchically imposed system militates against any potential for that kind of breakthrough. Well, what you require is a period where there's an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving profound and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature, characterized by a spirit of good, by a power seated upon the throne of their own soul.
Got a question. It says, but even whilst they deny aperture, I don't know what aperture means.
Think of deny. That is to deny and to say, I'm not going to represent, I'm not going to be a minister of that spirit. I'm denying that, and I'm saying I'm not going to represent that spirit. Minister of the spirit of the good. He says, it is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled with the electric life which burns within their words. You'll hear some things from LaRouche this afternoon which are absolutely electric, but which, as he goes on, in the end of this is the last paragraph of this defense of poetry by Percy Shelley, where he elaborates on the nature of the poet who mirrors the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present. The poet, the thinker, who is capable and impassioned to conceptualize the future. And this goes directly to this Promethean question of forecasting. If you are committed to a future, then you have to think through, what are the alternate pathways? What's leading to catastrophe? What could reverse that catastrophe and lead to a revolution, to a renaissance? And what you see with LaRouche is an individual in this tradition of Plato and Bach and Quincy Adams and many others who stands on their shoulders by virtue of his courage to assimilate, to work through their breakthroughs, their poetic breakthroughs, their scientific achievement, and then bring this to a higher level. Now, how'd this all happen? Again, there are a bunch of these in the back. I urge you to get it. At the age of 3, LaRouche challenged what he called company manners. And I suspect everyone in this room has experienced company manners. You're at home and your parents or you or your kids or whatever are gossiping about the neighbors, the relatives, bad-mouthing them, and then the neighbors or the relatives come to visit. And you immediately change your tune. And you go along to get along. And you say sweet nothings to people and pass the time, and absolutely say nothing truthful to your friends or relatives as you had conveyed in the protection of your household a moment before. It's a little like taking all the, the dirty clothes and stuff and throwing it in the closet while the neighbors are coming in. But more is that you are putting on company manners. This is a disgusting bit of hypocrisy, of lying. And Lyndon saw this with his parents at the age of 3. This is one of his early memories, which put him on a pathway of truth-seeking, as opposed to lying to go along to get along. When his grandfather, his paternal grandfather, died, he saw his father bitterly crying at the dinner table, seeing as if he saw his father's dead body. And what soon ensued in the household was a squabble over the division of the estate amongst the relatives. Perhaps some of you have experienced that. Yeah. And Lyndon developed rapidly in that context a hatred for acquiring wealth or position. He hated the squabbling over the money. He hated a certain kind of susceptibility which most people in this culture, in this monetary, materialist culture, have to self-degradation. And the habit of the hatred of squabbling for position or wealth has served him well. As he said, it made him a much better and happier individual. Then there was the theological conflict. He comes from a Quaker family, deeply religious, evangelical Quaker family, in which the notion of God was that God is accountable for human history, and that man is relatively unimportant in that configuration. Lyndon chose his maternal grandfather's outlook. Name was George Weir. That is the Christian outlook of George Weir, which is that man is accountable to God for the outcome of human history, and that man, each of us, to the limit of our talents, to the best of our capabilities, act for the good, act on history. That we don't leave it in God's hands. We don't excuse ourselves because of whatever. As Hamlet had a whole stream of rationalizations and excuses for cowardice and impotence, which led to the ruin of the kingdom, of the nation. If you know the play, virtually everybody is dead at the end. And Horatio comes on as a kind of chorus and says, let this scene lead you to recognize the evil of Hamlet-like cowardice, Hamlet-like fear, Hamlet-like refusal to make the Promethean choice, to conceptualize the solution, whatever it may be. So Lyndon, as a young boy, in his household, with his parents on the one side, with his grandfather on the other, determined that he would take responsibility for mankind. He studied many of the continental European philosophers, and he chose Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz as that philosopher most in tune with his developing outlook. This is as a young teenager. Why don't we go to Leibniz? Who's going to read? Can you read? Come on up.
Virtue is the habit of acting in accordance with wisdom, because it is necessary that practice accompany knowledge in order that the exercise of good actions become easy, natural, and turn to habits, such that habits become a second nature. Wisdom is the science of felicity. This is what we must study above all other things, because nothing is more desirable than felicity. That is the reason why we must always have our mind on top of the matter we are dealing with. That we always think about the main point, that is, that we often reflect on the intention or the objective to be reached. Diary, respite, sans. And that we say to ourselves from time to time, what am I doing? What is the purpose of this? Let's get to the main point. Thus, we would avoid wasting time with futilities or whatever becomes futility when we indulge in it for too long.
Can everybody see from wherever you're seated?
Yeah.
Okay.
Felicity is a
Yeah.
A little slower.
Speak slower and speak louder.
All right, sorry.
Let me do it differently. Let me do it differently because I don't like this translation. There's a better translation.
It's all right. It's the same one.
No, it's not. No. Let me just pick up here. Where were we? Felicity. Yeah, it's a very different. Okay. Felicity is a lasting state of pleasure. Yeah. Okay, so you can follow along there. Better listen. Felicity is Thanks. Is a lasting state of pleasure. Thus, it is good to abandon or moderate pleasures which can be injurious by causing misfortunes or by blocking the attainment of better and more lasting pleasures. Felicity is a knowledge or feeling of perfection, not only in ourselves but also in others. For in this way, some further perfection is aroused in us. To love is to find pleasure in the perfection of another. Justice is charity, or a habit of loving conformed to wisdom. Remember the agape, charity. Thus, when someone is inclined to justice, one tries to produce good for everybody so far as one can reasonably, but in proportion to the needs and merits of each. And even if one is obliged sometimes to punish evil persons, it is for the general good. Now, it is necessary to explain the feeling or the knowledge of perfection. The confused perception of some perfection constitutes the pleasure of sense. But this pleasure can be productive of greater imperfections which are born of it, as a fruit with a good taste and a good odor can conceal a poison. This is why one must shun the pleasures of sense, as one shuns a stranger or sooner a flattering enemy. Knowledge is of two kinds, that of facts and that of reasons. That of facts is perception, that of reasons is intelligence. Knowledge of reasons perfects us because it teaches us universal and eternal truths, which are manifested in the perfect being. Is it now the same? No.
Don't.
Okay, knock it off.
Just listen. Don't look.
Yeah.
It's a totally different translation. It's not.
But knowledge of facts is like that of the streets of a town, which serves us while we stay there, but after leaving, which we don't wish to burden our memory any longer. The pleasures of sense, which most closely approach pleasures of the mind, and are the most pure and the most certain, are that of music and that of symmetry. the former being pleasure of the ears, the latter of the eyes. For it is easy to understand the principles of harmony, this perfection which gives us pleasure. The sole thing to be feared in this respect is to use it too often. One need not shun at all pleasures which are born of intelligence or of reasons, as one penetrates the reason of perfections. That is to say, as one sees them flow from their source, which is the absolutely perfect being. The perfect being is called God. He is the ultimate reason of things and the cause of causes. Being the sovereign wisdom and the sovereign power, he's always chosen the best and acts always in an orderly way. One is happy when he loves God, and God, who has done everything perfectly, cannot fail to arrange everything thus, to elevate created beings to the perfection of which they are capable through union with him, which can subsist only through the Spirit. But one cannot love God without knowing his perfection or his beauty. And since we can know him only in his emanations, there are two means of seeing his beauty, namely in the knowledge of universal truths and in the knowledge of the harmony of the universe. That is to say, one must know the marvels of reason and the marvels of nature. The marvels of reason and of eternal truths, which our mind discovers in itself, are essential in the sciences of reasoning about numbers, about figures, about good and evil, about justice and injustice. The marvels of physical nature are the system of the universe, the structure of the bodies of animals, the causes of the rainbow, of magnetism, of the ebb and flow of the tides, and 1,000 other similar things. One must hold as certain that the more a mind desires to know order, reason, the beauty of things which God has produced, and the more he is moved to imitate this order in the things which God has left to his direction, the happier he will be. It is most true as a result that one cannot know God without loving one's brother, that one cannot have wisdom without having charity, which is the real touchstone of virtue, and that one even advances one's own good in working for that of others. For it is an eternal law of reason and of the harmony of things that the works of each person will follow it. Thus the sovereign wisdom has so well regulated all things that our duty must also be our happiness, that all virtue produces its own reward, and that all crime punishes itself sooner or later. Any thoughts on that? I know. God. That was a mouthful. Yeah. Well, take a couple. Yeah.
What I was going to say, what it sounds like the opposite of the nonsense that's going on, this whole perception, especially here in this country, of commercialism, individualism, and not being true to oneself and being charitable with others. It's like we live in a society of selfishness rather than that of cooperating with each other to try to get a common goal accomplished for the benefit of all and to raise the civilization. That's what it sounds like to me.
I began with the reference to the breakthrough in science and in statecraft, which LaRouches achieved in the late 70s and early 80s. And what you see is an idea which is put forward in that period based on what, I guess, Edward Teller called the common aims of mankind. So that you can take the several different parties. I don't think you can take let's take the two-party system. You can take the elements of these parties and you can overcome the dominant entropy, the dominant breakdown of society, which accrues from the false axioms within those parties. And you can define a higher hypothesis, a higher conception. You can define, if you will, common aims of mankind. What Leibniz is doing, what Linden, as a student of Leibniz, achieves, is a unity of human reason, and human reason as, if you will, a statement of the essence of man as a creative being, coherent with a universe which is knowably creative, which is self-developing, as opposed to a universe or anything within that universe which is fixed, which is static, which is not changing. As Plato emphasized, as Heraclitus picked up, that which is constant in this universe is a quality of change. But what Leibniz is getting at, and what Linden is developing, coherent with what we've discussed with this Promethean principle, is that a universe of this God, of the God of that his grandfather identified, of this notion of a creator who endows man with a creative capability to know the order of that creation. That what Leibniz is developing and what Linden picks up on and develops beyond anyone is a certain lawfulness of the harmony of the mind of man and the mind of the universe, if you will. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. Where we are now is he's 14 years old, and he's assimilating the ideas of Leibniz. Okay. What you have here is then a developing challenge to the predominant opinion, the stupidity, the prevailing axiom, which he's otherwise being taught in school, of a Euclidean outlook. Euclidean outlook in geometry is an outlook of a fixed universe, of axioms, postulates, theorems, which presumably explain the way the universe works. Next. Okay, there he's eighth, what is that? Is that eighth grade? I think it may be eighth grade. So it's something like 1935, or I think 1935. 8? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's not. Well, it's not eighth grade then. What the issue that comes up? He's in eighth grade, but the picture is from 5 years earlier. The eighth grade is around 1935. In any case, I don't know if you can see it, but Bob was driving along the Washington Bridge and snapped some pictures. Can people see what's interesting about that beam there? That's the Washington Bridge, the lower level. Anybody, can you, I don't know if you can see it. What's interesting about the beam?
It's the holes. The holes in it?
You're a shill. Anybody else? Okay. No, yeah. See the holes?
Yeah.
Okay. Why would there be holes in there? Presumably that's a beam between the lower deck and the upper deck, and it's holding up a lot of weight. Well, it's a connecting point, but why would you put the holes in there? What's that?
What'd you say?
Let the wind.
You said make the wind through. I got that.
Yeah.
Makes it stronger.
How can it make it stronger?
Because the shape of the circle.
The stress on the beam.
You gotta talk louder.
The property of a circle.
What?
Compressive force rather than
The force of gravity on the beam will allow it to be balanced
You're
out.
saying there's a certain property derived from the construction of that hole which makes it stronger.
In the winter, in the winter it gets tighter, the material, and in the summer it loosens up. So maybe the whole
Depending on the temperature.
contraction.
Expands and contracts.
Very simple. When you build a piece of steel like that, you put holes in some of the supports and other things to to reduce the weight so there's less pressure and less weight on the joints and the support. So you hold the bridge together, you're holding less weight, and therefore the structure can take more weight than it normally would.
Okay.
On me, the picture of that boy, is that LaRouche?
That's LaRouche, yeah.
Understand it?
Yeah. Somehow he looks a little different. I don't know. That's LaRouche, yeah. That's why Bob put it up there. In any case, the issue involved here is that at the age of 13 or 14, in his, I think, 8th grade plane geometry class, LaRouche challenged his teacher, who he says was a very sympathetic figure from the Society of Friends, also a Quaker that he knew, the teacher, because he would not accept. He had been at the Charlestown, Massachusetts Naval Shipyard, and he saw something like that. He saw probably a bridge structure with beams with holes in them. And you would assume that you have this beam there holding up a heavy weight, and the more metal you have in the beam, the more it can hold up. That's what you would assume. That would be a prevailing axiom in plane geometry. And that's what the teacher said. LaRouche walked in and said, wait a second, why is it that you have the hole in the beam? And this is indicative. This was a big moment in his life in terms of actually challenging, thinking through independently that which opposes prevailing popular opinion, which in the classroom setting is this Euclidean geometry, is the system of axioms and postulates. The axiom being the stronger, the more solid the beam, the more weight it can hold up. Okay. So what he discusses, and it's interesting, you have, if you work through Kepler, among others, what you discover is a transparency in his thinking. Kepler shares with his readership through the ages an understanding of the process of mind, the process of cognition by which he develops hypothesis and higher hypothesis. And in Linden's case, he has, this is the tremendous joy of working through this stuff, but also there's a certain difficulty, because this is he's 90, he's been around a while, and he takes great pains through a series of autobiographies. I guess the EIR editors wrote the other one. He didn't write that one. Yeah. There's 2 autobiographies and various other papers and autobiographical sections in his articles and books. He's probably written, arguably he is more prolific than anybody else on the planet, living on the planet. But what he takes great pains to do is to make transparent his method of thinking, his development of a science of knowledge. So, and what he identifies in this connection is that he develops his character against what is the sociologist Reisman calls an other-directed personality, which is akin to the person trapped in popular opinion. He is directed by others. He's directed by prevailing popular opinion. He goes along to get along, as opposed to what Reisman calls the inner-directed personality, the individual who develops an independent outlook. In LaRouche's case, this is not do your own thing. This is quite the contrary. This is not an independent outlook or an original outlook which is based on whatever he feels like. This is the development of a scientific outlook. Okay. So he's, 13 or 14. Then he comes to what he describes as one of the 2 most important decisions in his life. This is 1941, 42, I guess he's 19, 20, thereabouts. And there's a world war. He spent some summers working in a shoe factory, I think, under a Polish Jew named Benny Shapiro, who tells him and others about the development of fascism, of Nazism in Europe. And the war hits. He's a Quaker, a religious Quaker. And his parents, when he's very young, when he goes off to school, his parents insist that he act as Quakers are compelled to, that if he's attacked in any way, he will not attack back. He will not strike blows. And he incurs many blows as a young boy and man as a result. But what you have is that he's got a deep loyalty to his parents. At the same time, he's developed the theological views that I identified earlier, coherent with George Weir, his grandfather, that God puts us here, if you will. We are accountable to God for our actions. And therefore, if you're in a world of this kind of evil, then you have to act against that evil. And so, over an extended fight within the household, within his own conscience, his father says to him at the beginning of the war, you have to maintain conscientious objection to the war. That is, that you are not going to enlist to fight and deliver and to kill, to engage in that war. And he bends to that demand for a period of time out of loyalty to his parents. At a certain point, he breaks with that, and he determines he is going to, according to a higher conscience, which conscience is based on this notion of Christianity, and of one's that which is important in one's action in life. And so he breaks with his parents, which is a very big deal. He says at one point in his one of the autobiographies, he says there are two classes of important decisions in life. The first, relatively less profound, are those important decisions we make because of what we are. The second, more profound, are those processes of decision-making which make us what we are. Processes of decision-making which make us what we are. And so the development of this, of these beliefs, originally in theology, representing a philosophical world outlook, becomes decisive in shaping what he is, what he becomes. Okay, we'll come to the second decision in a minute. The end of the war, 1946. He's in Burma, then India. And he is 1945, India. Is there anything more to it? Okay. That's Leonard around the age of 22 or thereabouts during the war. But in India, you have, as you would know, a great struggle for the independence of the nation. And Lynn is in Calcutta in 1946 amidst that struggle. And two things happen which are of profound importance to him. One is that he's approached by some Indian coolies who ask the young American soldier if, at the point of the desired independence of India, if he would work to export, to avail to India, to the newly independent nation, textile machinery. It's a big country. A lot of clothes, a lot of textiles. And they need, as an independent nation, they would need such machinery to develop. And so they ask Lynn his opinion on this, and he says, I am just a soldier, but I would certainly work for that objective. Soon thereafter, there are these famous riots in Calcutta. he's right there, and he sees the bestiality, the brutality of the British Empire in mowing down large numbers of Indians and of setting into motion the historic conflict, Muslim-Hindu, which ends up with the creation of two nations, Pakistan and India. But he develops at that moment a lifelong commitment. This is decisive in his lifelong commitment, political commitment, to take or to develop the United States as responsible for the economic development of the developing nations of the world. And you'll get a fuller sense of that in a few minutes. What's that?
It was about the time of the
UN is April of 45. This is in 46. He's in Calcutta with these horrible riots. Okay, then Goethe's Prometheus. He comments that he had more than a special degree of appreciation for Goethe's poem Prometheus. For time reasons, I won't go through it. The point is to hark back to where I began. Is you have an emerging conception of a Promethean personality, and this, what he took from this, is the idea, he says, a conscious articulation that he would dedicate his life to make men in his image being the Promethean image, to liberate mankind from their fear and their stupidity, and uplift and transform individuals and transform mankind to advance the condition of creation, to advance the human condition. He says at that point that first he would qualify himself to accomplish that purpose. Okay, let us go to the first part of the. This is a. Is this the first? Is this the beginning? Okay, this is from a 1984 video called "The Power of Labor." Well, it speaks for itself.
The most obvious empirical actuality of the existence of any human individual is that that individual is born and must ultimately die. The beginning of wisdom lies in understanding the practical significance of this simple fact. If an individual devotes his or her life to those pleasures enjoyed in the flesh, the sum of that person's life goes into the grave. Only to the degree that an individual life is sufficiently dedicated to some higher purpose, whose benefit to mankind endures beyond death of the individual person, does the person rise above the moral condition of a mere beast. That judgment is the beginning of all wisdom. The wise individual dedicates himself or herself to contributing good to the advantage of present and future generations. As each person must desire to accomplish in living something which elevates his moral condition above that of an irrationalistic, hedonistic beast, so the contribution of good to present and future generations of mankind is the only true personal self-interest of any person. The first problem is that of discovering what is this good. The injunction from Genesis supplies the germ of the answer to that question. The good done by individuals is the individual's contribution to the fulfillment of that commandment. The individual must not merely accomplish that in terms of his or her individual acts. The individual must contribute to increasing the fruitfulness of present and future generations. To contribute a useful scientific discovery is the paradigm of the good. Yet we must know that scattering individual good deeds may be of no benefit. If society around us destroys that good more or less rapidly as we scattered about us, we require a society which fosters the good and which acts to nullify that which opposes the good. The highest good we may contribute, therefore, is the improvement of the institutions of our society to the effect that society itself better fosters the good. The contribution to the advancement of science and culture of society is the most powerful and most durable expression of the good. Yet to act efficiently for the good, we must be developed and must work consistently and constantly to develop ourselves. We must increase our powers to know the good, and also increase our power to act efficiently in service of what we know to be good. Similarly, we must foster the initial development of such powers in children. We must contribute to fostering in society those institutions and habits of practice which encourage and otherwise aid men and women to continue an efficient process of self-development to these ends. The principle of self-development is the principle of discovering with ever-diminishing imperfection what the lawful ordering of our universe is. In other words, the principle of self-development is a principle of scientific discovery.
Sounds like Leibniz? Now, at this point in his development, this is 1946, 1948, he makes the second of his most important decisions, as he puts it, which is his decision to work to refute the information theory dogma, which is being developed at that point, particularly by Norbert Wiener. You can put Wiener up, I guess. Are you going to show him, Laura? I think so. Which, you've all heard of this. This is now 65 years later. And information theory, information society, information economy, the new economy, systems analysis, artificial intelligence.
Is that the internet?
Is what?
Is that the internet?
Well, the internet comes out of it, yes. That this takes off in this post-war period. This is the method of enslavement of the culture, of the mind of the population that is initiated by oligarchism, by the oligarchy in the post-war period. Here you have a moment when the United States, with allies, the United States, the Russians, so on, have defeated fascist evil. And you have the United States, which is the dominant economic power in history, having made a series of economic revolutions during the war. And LaRouches, as he describes, is determined that the United States will be it will exert leadership in the development of humanity. Thereupon lies the potential to extirpate this oligarchism at that point, to create an unprecedented revolution, renaissance for mankind. So what the oligarchy does is draw on its bag of tricks, going back to Euclid and Aristotle and John Locke, and we can name all these philosophers that LaRouche rejected when he was young. And they come up with a series of new dogmas which represent a means of manipulation of the mind of the population. That the essence of this ideology is, you're gonna have to work through these two, which are in the back, or we're going to do another class or series of classes, maybe 10 or 20, to actually work through this whole thing. But let's reduce this to its essentials. That you have the oligarchical model, which renders man as beast, which intends to perpetuate their rule, Zeus's rule, by shutting down the possibility of Promethean thinking, Promethean action. How do you do that? You argue that man is nothing more than a talking beast, that man is no better than a higher ape, that the mind of man is really fundamentally no different than that of an animal. The animal can learn things. The dog can learn from his master how to sit, or something of that sort. But the idea of a dog or any beast assimilating the power of fire and using that power, no, that couldn't be. Man, of course, has that Promethean capability. That's this metaphor of fire that Aeschylus develops. What Wiener and von Neumann, in the tradition of Bertrand Russell and so on, of this school going way back, of empiricism, of reductionism, of logical positivism. What their argument is that the mind of man is a blank slate which mind absorbs data, sense impression, sense perception, and takes that data into his senses and deduces from that data his experience and determines his outlook. That there's no capacity to cognize, to create a higher idea from the standpoint of Wiener and company. The mind of man is fundamentally no different than the capability of a computer. This is called artificial intelligence, which develops out of Wiener's cybernetics and information theory and systems analysis. And therefore the possibility of generating higher hypothesis, generating a higher idea, a more truthful idea, a fundamentally new idea reflective of the lawfulness of creation, of the universe, of actually developing what we call universal physical principle. That is not in the domain of the mind of man. That's what's being argued here. I mean, this is the height of evil, of oligarchical evil, which is imposed on popular culture in the wake of beginning in the wake of World War II, and it takes off. So that, you know, over the last decades, we've had information economy, the new economy, based on this internet, which essentially argues that what we produce is information. We don't produce food. On computers, you don't produce food. Computers have their purpose. But when it comes to tackling the existential crisis, tackling whatever the paradox may be, when an axiomatic system, a set of beliefs, reaches a boundary condition, comes up against the limit of those beliefs. That is to say, when you reach a moment like now, or the series of crises over the last 50 years, and the predominant beliefs in economy, or in statecraft, or in politics, or in science, in culture, when these beliefs are no longer sustaining human progress, then there must be something wrong with those beliefs. That is, we have a metric here. It becomes, LaRouche is developing a means of measuring progress, of measuring the relationship between the mind of man as the mind conceptualizes, discovers, invents new ideas, called the idea metaphor, a new idea which tackles and solves some kind of paradox. That you can take that new idea, let's say the splitting of the atom, the development of atomic power in the 20th century, which represents a much more powerful idea or scientific principle in terms of man's mastery of nature, of this physical universe. It gives man far greater power. You have that thing there? The one, the energy flux density one? You have that. Not that one.
Oh, the cone.
Yeah, okay. For example, for 400,000 years, we burned wood. This goes back to fire. But the dominant mode of energy, of powering human activity, human society, production of food, other needs of mankind, for 400,000 years we were dependent upon wood as the predominant source of power, of energy, of man's mastery over nature. Then you have the development of coal, which becomes dominant through the period of the 19th century, until this black gook is transformed into something usable by man. And so you have, for a century or so, the age of oil, the petroleum age. In the 20th century, you have a higher idea, a new idea developed in the mind of Marie Curie and a few others of fission power, nuclear or atomic power. LaRouches created the Fusion Energy Foundation in 1974 with an array of leading scientists of this nation, of Europe, and so on, for the purpose of discovering thermonuclear power had been discovered. It was called the hydrogen bomb. That was uncontrolled thermonuclear power. But of harnessing that power, of taking the power within the sun and controlling it in such a way as to provide a quality and magnitude of power, of energy, far beyond what man had known before. So you look at the weight equivalent, and you need 23 tons of wood to provide the same power as 6 tons of coal or 30 barrels of oil or 1.86 grams of uranium. That's not much. 1.86 grams. That's like tiny. That's a weight, gram. It's very small. Right? Okay. And 0.57 grams of heavy hydrogen in seawater, which is the source, the fuel for the process called thermonuclear fusion power. And then eventually we'll get, hopefully we survive this crisis, we'll get to antimatter. But I'm using this as paradigmatic of a process by which the mind of the scientist, the mind of the discoverer, creates a new language, if you will, a metaphor. As Kepler discovers the law of universal gravitation, which is not something that you see. Anybody see gravitation in the room? I mean, you notice you're not floating around. So your hat is coming down. In any case, that there's a discovery of universal principle, typified by the discovery of gravitation, or by this kind of thing. Wiener, von Neumann, and so on insist upon the opposite. And thereby they consign humanity to a fixed universe, to a fixed level of existence, where man is reduced to the status of an animal who is incapable of making such discovery. Axiomatically, that's not the domain, that man has no such capability. The best man can do is deduce from experience, from sense data, and develop computers which allow us to do things more efficiently, to compute and such things. But, garbage in, garbage out. That whatever is programmed into the computer is what you will get out of it. As opposed to, no computer that I know of has yet discovered a true universal principle in nature, let alone in the mind of man. Okay, there's much to say about this. Let me just take in this realm my notes. I say the mind, the economy, living processes all get reduced to what Wiener discusses: statistical information theory, a deductive axiomatic system. Such systems, by the nature of the system, break down. That is, they run up against some kind of limit, as in, for example, an economy which runs up against the limit of the resource base of that economy. And either you supersede that resource base as you're running out of fuel or food or whatever raw materials are needed for the future of that economy, of that society, of that population. Either you make a breakthrough and develop something new and better, or not. Why don't we what LaRouches does in this several-year period in challenging these ideas of a fixed deductive system in which man's mind is no better than that of a computer, is he develops the original discovery of the relationship between this metaphor generating cognitive power, Promethean power of man, of the mind of man, and the progress of society, the progress of humanity. And this, he develops this as something susceptible of knowledge, susceptible of forecasting, and susceptible of measure. That is, he develops a metric by which to know that the application or injection of certain ideas, discoveries, which create new technologies, say like atomic power, it's a discovery in principle which generates a new technology of harnessing energy. That you can measure the future of society, the future of that economy, the potential progress of man, based on this quality of cognition, this quality of concept formation, this Promethean quality. Okay, so in that sense, economic science becomes the king of all sciences, because economic science is about human reproduction, the reproduction of humanity, of a higher condition of life for humanity, of longevity, lifespan, the quality, material quality of life, the cultural quality of life, the potential for the education of young people in that society in such a way that young people have a better future, a brighter future, that young people are, if you will, better people. I don't mean morally, well, I do mean morally. Young people are more intelligent. Obviously, we can adduce that we've done a lot wrong for the last 50 years because the young people are not more intelligent now. The young people now are very good with the internet, with computers. But they generally lack something in terms of a quality of discovery, of scientific and cultural discovery. Not the young people in this room. Okay.
I hate the internet.
Huh?
I hate the internet.
You hate the internet, okay.
It's good for some things, but it's predominantly bad for a lot of things.
Yeah, well, it's bad for the development of the human mind. Good. If you want information, it's there. That's all good. It might be helpful. But in terms of what allows the reproduction of humanity, what allows progress, this militates. This is the oligarchy militating against the Promethean principle.
Well, that's precisely the point, that if you only believe in wider facts, you negate God, and you negate the higher force of man, which is to develop beyond himself. And that goes back thousands and thousands of years before Wiener, when you had Prometheus, when you had, of course he's a god, but anyway, when you had people thinking beyond the human condition, themselves, their biological self, where they were able to rise above this fact system. So Wiener, in effect, and we've come all the way to 1950s, to negate the whole rest of the existence of man.
Yeah, I mean, humanity.
That's obvious right there that he's wrong.
Humanity is threatened by extinction now,
Yes.
given the nature of thermonuclear weapons. But that, in turn, is a function of this ages-old, millennia-old imposition of this oligarchical principle, of a fixed society, of a fixed human mind, of fixed technology, which thereby leads man to this danger of extinction. You've had renaissances throughout history, as you referenced the Greek case, the Renaissance of Aeschylus, of Socrates and Plato, and you've had dark ages throughout history. What LaRouches is actually up to is creating the potential for unending progress by taking oligarchism, Zeus, and crushing it and sealing the pit, if you will, sealing their doom.
In modern times, the proof of human creativity is the fact that fission and the equations by which they figured that fission was possible was done pre-computer age. Interesting. In other words, it came out of the human mind.
Back then, the Greeks, the Romans, everybody.
All the way in the beginning.
And it's not developed by a computer.
Let me move, because I want to pull it together and make sure people have some time to raise some things. This is what LaRouche calls his machine tool principle. So think about what I've just developed as against Wiener and company, as against information theory. Current levels of development of individual creative reason. Current levels of development of creative reason, which generates discoveries of valid, of truthful principles, like the principle of fission power, or so on. Which in turn, that you develop the principle, and in the process you are creating some hypothesis beyond what you had known before, what you had thought through before. And then the new hypotheses generate, on the one side, the design of those machines, which in turn create machines, out of which come new and improved designs of whatever product. On the other side, the discovery of new hypotheses gives us classical humanist education, by which LaRouche means this Socratic, anti-Euclidean process of cognition, where what you're actually doing in general in classical humanist education is you're immersing yourself in the discoveries of the greatest discoverers in history. You're actually working through, as LaRouche has done, as I was stressing earlier. He has the advantage of standing on the shoulders of those who've come before. But you're working through these discoveries in your own mind. You are making those ideas, those discoveries, your own. You're not engaged in drill and grill. You're not going to school, to university, to get the grade. You're not interested in that. LaRouche was a brilliant but poor student. Brilliant but poor, because he didn't care about grades, getting ahead, money, position, as I went through earlier. Rather, you're involved in a lifelong search for truth. That's classical humanist education. That's what, by and large, has dropped out of American education, European education, over these information society decades. That education, in turn, yields a developed labor force. That is a labor force which is capable of assimilating more new and better methods of designing machinery, of applying machinery into the productive process, so that you then combine that with these elements, out of which you get a productive process of increased productivity. That is an individual, as Leibniz put it, I guess, that you develop an individual capable of doing the work previous of 100 individuals, as with the breakthrough called the steam engine, steam power, such that one individual applying that new technology at the turn of the 18th century and through the 18th century can accomplish the work of 100 others previous. That in turn allows you to increase what we call potential relative population density, the capacity of a society, of a given land area, to sustain a population at a certain quality of life, condition of life. This is necessary, that is, the growth of population, contrary to the depopulation genocidalists and the zero growth movement, the zero technological growth crowd. The growth of population by leaps and bounds is necessary because you need a greater division of labor to generate new discoveries and to engage in the productive activity that the future of humanity requires. And that increase will yield higher levels of development of human creative reason.
I was just gonna say that about your existential crisis. About like, you know, most jobs that I find that people that are out there for like youth are like kind of meaningless. Like, why would you want to work a minimum wage job doing something that's totally meaningless? So I think that, you know, that's an issue as well. I don't know how that ties in, but
Yeah, most activity, most employment has zero to do with reproducing humanity. Most of it's make work, unnecessary work, and so on and so forth, which demeans man into beast, which is the oligarchical intention.
Which is desired because they can then be controlled.
Say it again.
Which is desired because not desirable, but which is desired sociologically to control man.
Okay, this is the secret to LaRouche's method of economic forecasting. This process, this discovery, in opposition to this axiomatic deductive outlook, this fixed outlook, is that this discovery opens up for LaRouche the pathway to become the greatest discoverer greatest forecaster in economic science in history, which begins around 1956. Why don't we go to the weekly report? I'll get to those.
And we have a population today which is much more stupid in this century now, this new century, than it was in the previous century. And then you look at things like the development of physical science in the 1890s and immediately following, before the 1920s. And you find there's a degeneration in the capability of scientific thinking among the population. What we got from Einstein, for example. Einstein's just an example of these several people of great creative minds coming out of the developments of the 19th century in particular, which did this. And you had it earlier in the musical development. You have it the same way. So it's our lack of opening of our minds to these kinds of things. And instead of doing as most fools do, and they are fools, is instead of assuming that classical musical composition is some kind of old thing or something of that nature, this is actually a capability on which the progress of mankind coming out of the Dark Ages brought forth this kind of understanding. The elements, of course, that existed as far as ancient Greece. You get ancient Greek culture has elements of this thing which are very clearly defined as such elements. You have in classical poetry, truly classical poetry, going way back, you get the same thing, and you get the orgiastic cultures which are degenerate. And the contest has always been this, the struggle between this man understanding himself in the universe, man willfully shaping the way that a society functions, and that's what we have. That's what we lost. We have lost that. We have a stupid generation now, stupid population, and our problem is we've got to rescue people from this kind of stupidity.
Yeah, we saw that we've been seeing this over and over again. This type of it's moral degeneration, which is closely related to demoralization. But it's reflected in right now the inability to act on this whole war threat, because people are trying to move based on what's previously occurred. Now, thermonuclear war has never occurred before. So statistically, that means it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
But it's because if it ever happened, we wouldn't be here. And so, but that really, it's rampant in the way that people think. Is it's a deductive way of thinking rather than what you're laying out, which is this classical way of thinking.
Yeah, which is in Bach in particular, that you make an opening statement. That is not your composition. That's the setup. And now you go into the ironical development of this process. Now that you go from the conclusion of the composition now becomes back and becomes the leading element of the composition, so that the order of space and time is different. And this is what I've depended upon in all my forecasting. It depends upon exactly that principle. It's the same principle that is true of Bach's preludes and fugues in particular. It's what's true of all classical music of any competence whatsoever. It always has the same. You go through the experience, and when you reach the end, you go back. You realize you have to go back to the beginning to understand what the meaning of the beginning was. And that's the process. And all my forecasting that is based on this. Not just music, was based on this. And that does work. You can forecast the future. Man can and must forecast the future. If mankind does not develop the power to forecast the future, mankind is doomed. As the case now. Like all these idiots who are supporting Obama saying it's bad, but it's not that bad. In other words, here we are, you have the former president of the United States, Bill Clinton, has attached himself with great regret to Obama. My view is that Clinton actually despises and hates Obama. But he adapts to things that way and accepts to some degree, at least by his actions, accepts what is happening. We are now headed for the extermination of the human species, because what we're on the threshold of now is a thermonuclear war. All the elements are there. The triggers are all there. And if someone gets to a certain point and sets off the Middle East, like this Arab operation, Saudi Arabia, if they set that thing into motion, this will go, if Obama is president, this will go to thermonuclear war. It can happen still this year, or the beginning of next year. That's where we are. And it's more likely to the beginning this year than next year at this time. So therefore we're in peril precisely because we are stupid. And our stupidity consists in the fact that we don't understand that it is possible to forecast the future, not to predict an event, but to forecast the condition in the future, and to estimate the time frame in which that development will occur. It doesn't mean it can't be changed, but it's precisely the point. You can change it if you can forecast it. If you can forecast what's going to happen, you can intervene to change it. And that's been the characteristic of all great discoveries of principle in science and so forth, and in culture otherwise, as in music. You're able to see the future not as an event, plopping down before you, but you see a change in the tension, the organization of society. And that's all my forecasting has been done, and I've been unique on this. I mean, all the major forecasting efforts since I started this thing in the middle of that
1950s.
Yeah. That it's always been that way, and it always worked. The problem is most people, especially leading political circles, are incapable of competent forecasting of the future. First of all, because they don't know what forecasting is. They think it's what statistical predicting. They think that a statistical pattern, and it never works that way. But actual competent forecasting is one instrument which we depend upon, and we're going to find that as we go into space, especially this Mars development, as we take on this question of dealing with these asteroids floating around out there, we're going to have to exactly use that approach of forecasting to deal with it. How are we going to deal with all these, majority of all these asteroids out there between Mars area and Earth area? All of this stuff is deadly, and we don't know much about it, and you're not going to be able to predict it mechanically.
Right.
You're going to have to find a characteristic of the space which gives you a ability to forecast where this collaboration and what goes.
Right. As you said, the forecasting is not. It's a question of actually giving mankind an ability to act. It's about action. It's about creating action. A successful forecast is not predicting some event and letting that event occur. A successful forecast is actually creating the capability of mankind to create a new state, to create a new change.
Is to forecast a phase space change. That's what you can do.
Which is, again, what you're warning about now, is we're heading to a crisis point.
Yep.
Where the way people have been accustomed to operate in a certain conditioning, certain framework of reference, can't continue to exist.
No.
You look at the hyperinflationary collapse, the complete disintegration of the economic system, the acceleration of that collapse, and the strategic tension. The way people have conditioned themselves to operate is in an environment that's about to completely transform around them.
So this is LaRouche a couple of weeks ago. But you're looking, this is fascinating to look at this, knowing that embedded in his 1950s development of a method of forecasting, though he's obviously transformed it, made revolutions in it, nevertheless, the germ of it was there in the 1950s. So that you're not predicting an event. This is not horse track, or crystal ball gazing or something. You're saying, here is the pathway. We're going to, we have this crisis, we have this danger, we have this pending catastrophe, or we have an opportunity if we change it in such and such a way. So that his initial forecast, 1956, 57, which accurately forecasts the recession of that period, he comes out of that forecast with, he develops a subsequent forecast by 1960 or so, that the post-war monetary system, the post-war Bretton Woods monetary system, is going to break down unless there's some decisive change in prevailing policy. And he creates this movement, 1965, 1966, based on that forecast. That is, insofar it is as he knows the future pathways, essentially. Says, look, if I know this in a Promethean fashion of foresight, then I must act in a Promethean fashion to shape history in such a way that we don't go through hell. We don't lose the Bretton Woods system and go to hell. Well, in 1971, August 15, the LaRouche forecast of a series of monetary crises in the late 60s leading into the breakdown of that post-war system, and I'm giving a snapshot here for time reasons. August 15, 1971, that forecast was validated by the famous Nixon televised address saying that we are ending the Bretton Woods system, the gold-backed monetary system, and so on. I met LaRouche the next day, August 16th, 1971, at Columbia, where he had been on vacation, and then this thing exploded, and he raced down to New York and gave an address for a couple of hundred people. And this movement totally exploded in the ensuing 2 years, 71, 72, 73, with like 1,000 people joining Lynn in the Labor Committee organization. That is, he created the organization in the mid-60s knowing that he needed to develop this Promethean quality amongst young thinkers of this nation, of Europe, and beyond. He needed to do that if he were to develop the capacity to act on history. Lerner. A few months later, in December 2nd, in 71, Lynn had this famous debate. You have 1 minute? Well, if they can. Anyhow.
It's kind of muffled.
Now, the President said that this precisely how it did shock the 1933 army in Germany. It was waving the floor to prevent the inflation and it also increased intelligence.
Okay, got it.
He may personally detach himself from that, but it's not possible for a politician to accept his intelligence to detach themselves from the kind of government and the kind of procedures which enable those abstractions to become
Cut it
reality.
off. Anyhow, it's difficult sound. But this is.
He will go away.
That's what the oligarch has been saying. So this is a few months after the August 15th end of the Bretton Woods system, which came like a thunderbolt. on the nations of the world. This is the system that had been developed at the end of World War II at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And the system had broken down. It reached its limit. And the other thunderbolt was that Lyndon LaRouche had uniquely forecast that this was going to happen. And so the movement took off. He challenged the quackademic economists, the quackademics. Abel Lerner was one of the chief of these quackademics at Queens College, sort of the spokesman for the liberal economists of this. And his argument was, you guys are putting forward a response to Bretton Woods which will guarantee the economics of Wehrmacht, which is Nazi Germany, right? And the appropriate political dictatorship that goes with it. And the movement just took off as he challenged me and my young friends at the time across the nation and elsewhere to recognize the consequences, the forecastable, foreseeable consequences of political inaction or a specific form of political action. By the mid-'70s, Lynn had proposed, the International Development Bank launched his first presidential campaign, which as a philosopher and scientist, he was not exactly, I don't know that prior to 1974, 75, that Lynn had thought of running for president. But by the mid-'70s, he decided to develop a presidential organization. That is an organization committed to organize through the presidential campaigns, given that the United States is created as a presidential system, as I'd said earlier, that he put himself forward to rally a leadership and to challenge the stupidity within the population. He put forward an approach toward reorganizing the world economy. Okay, why don't we go to the so his first audio. In 1976, Lynn does the famous presidential address 2 days before the November election in '76, when he says in a 30-minute broadcast to the nation that a vote for Carter is a vote for thermonuclear war. And I'll come to the significance of this in a second. But this is at a Labor Committee conference in 1978.
We represent the most important thing that has happened to the human race since Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. There has never been, since Leibniz, a force like ours, comparable to ours, with our understanding of what the word reason ought to mean, of our understanding of the power of reason, and of our understanding of the laws of reason. How do we influence world events? Do we give marching orders to sections of the world? No, we don't. We don't have any such power. Occasionally one of our members gets a little angry and says to some politician or somebody else, "You must do this now." I fully sympathize with a member. But that's not how we work. That's an incidental. That's the necessary, but that's not the fundamental aspect of what we do. What we do is to communicate conceptions which happen to be correct. We communicate them in such a way that we activate the power of reason in the minds of other persons and give them certain essential conceptions for which these reactivated powers of reason can work over. Our power is not our power as a proprietary thing. It is not our giving marching orders. It is our activating the power of reason to a limited or lesser degree or greater degree in the minds of many people, including people of influence. And our power is their reason. Our power is creating a network of reason throughout the world, so that we can't trace directly. We could, but we don't. We can't. We don't have the resources. But we know in a few cases how these things work, and we know how the whole pattern works. we have created the most important network, a global network in the history of humanity. A network of reason. A network of people who, with our influence and through other influences, but our marginally decisive contribution, have activated the power of reason within people of influence and others, and have given these people whose reason has been activated concepts produced by our reason, which give them a global overview of the world as it now is, and at the same time give them a global overview of the human race as a process. A global overview of what the nature of man must be and is. A global overview of the struggle to build a society which agrees with man's nature. The power of creative reason which distinguishes a man from a cow or a pig. That this is a struggle in which we and our predecessors have engaged for thousands of years. An unending struggle to rid the humanity of the forces of bestialism. The forces typified by Otto von Habsburg, the British monarchy, Willy Brandt, the Socialist International, William Buckley, and all those other cruds today, and the environmentalists. This represents the force of evil. And our generation and future generations must be freed from the threat of being subverted and destroyed by the force of evil. We must bequeath to the future generations of humanity the security that the human race will live and will survive and will not be plunged into bestiality. And we get that concept across in varying degrees to people in whom we have catalyzed and stimulated a perception of reason. And then they, benefiting from this stimulation from us, act with enhanced powers, with a modified and improved conscience, which is the result of our catalytic influence. And to the extent that our conceptions conform to what reason dictates, informed reason dictates is necessary, our conceptions slide through these networks of reason as a natural thing. Not without freakouts and delays and so forth, but that's the process. Mexico, parts of Latin America, all kinds of places. Japan, you find the elements of reason, the policies of reason, begin to take hold in international relations among these layers. Not because there's been a direct conspiracy. Oh, there are conspiracies enough. But not because this was rigged by us by conspiracy. We activated reason. We enriched it. We gave it the informed concepts it needed. And reason, acting through many people in many parts of the world, converged and found itself in agreement with itself.
Within 5 years of that network of reason produced a revolution within the U.S. presidency, which the SDI, as I indicated at the outset, reestablished elements of a constitutional presidency based on the original discovery of the American Republic. Strategic Defense Initiative, which is based in turn on the universal physical principle of directed energy targeting a nuclear weapon to make impotent and obsolete nuclear weapons. Like a what? Like a
tax to fund that?
A tax? No, this is like the development of a defense to eliminate the danger of nuclear weapons, which could have eliminated then and there the danger that humanity is in now. But by virtue of this method, that is the conceptualization of a discovery of universal principle and the organization of such a network of reason in the world, LaRouche created such an historic breakthrough, which could have opened up at that point in time just this unparalleled renaissance of science, of culture, of economic progress. However, LaRouche then became the target of this oligarchy as Prometheus had before, who intended to kill him, they tried 3 times, or at least to silence this movement. I won't go through that history now for lack of time. But what then happens is that this same method of forecasting unfolds, and just to bring it up to the most recent period, you look at this. You have the forecast of 2001. You have the forecast of 2001 when at the beginning of the year Bush is coming in and LaRouche forecasts a 9/11. He didn't call it 9/11, didn't know the date it was happening, but he said something like this, like the Reichstag fire of Germany, lawfully could happen in the period ahead, so as to impose a dictatorship to suppress the creation of a new economic system. And then he forecasts in July of 2007 the explosion of the monetary system, the collapse of the world financial system, which begins 3 days later into the 2007-2008 crisis. And then when Obama comes in, he forecasts that Obama, psychopathologically, he diagnoses him as a Nero type, and forecasts the danger of dictatorship, as in Nero or Hitler, fascist economic destruction and war. So look at what's unfolded. Now the question, to pull this together, is a forecast that either we crush this two-party system, the axiom of that, if you will, anti-American system. Either we crush it by replicating at a higher level what LaRouche achieved between 76, 77, and 83. And we reestablish this principle in statecraft, that we reestablish the American presidential system as a qualified leadership, as a network of reason, in concert with such like-minded individuals, especially in Russia and China, and we reestablish a community of principle, as Roosevelt intended, as LaRouche intended at the end of the war, a community of principle of sovereign republics, sovereign nation states, to secure a process of unending progress, unending discovery. You guys have anything?
We have time fast.
I'll argue that the greatest discovery in universal physical principle in the history of statecraft is made by Franklin and company. That is, the principles on which the American Republic is founded, the principles on which the Republic is founded, in the Declaration, in the Federalist Papers, which argue for a constitutional framework, in the Constitution, in Hamilton's reports on manufacture, public credit, national banking, is that we achieve the height of statecraft in human history. And it's the case that Washington did not intend a party system. Washington opposed the idea of such a party system. Washington was committed to a presidential system, which is embedded in the Constitution. For those of you who saw the press conference 3 weeks ago of Congressman Jones, Bruce Fein, Colonel Wilkerson, you will recall that they developed a constitutional framework for immediate action, where they emphasized that impeachment is put into the Constitution by Franklin because in this nation we do not want to kill the king or the president. We don't want a coup d'etat. We want a simple constitutional method or procedure by which to remove a president who becomes untrustworthy. Constitutional principle. That the question of declaration of war must be in the hands of the representatives of the people, of the House of Representatives, as opposed to a king, since we were working against an empire ruled by a monarchy which sent young men into war repeatedly. This was not tolerable. But you had such constitutional principle, which was the guidepost for the nation. I'll elaborate on this later, but what LaRouche does in 1977 76, 77 through 83, around his principle called Strategic Defense Initiative, is to reestablish a functional presidency, even around this around Reagan. And that presidency consisted of leading scientists who came to understand the principle we call SDI, leading intelligence operatives, military personnel, politicians, and so on in many nations. That LaRouche succeeded in this period, 1977 to 83, in reestablishing a constitutional presidency of a society based on consent of the governed. This begins the Republican idea, consent of the governed, which Americans are familiar with. But he at the same time posed the paradox that the governed constitute an infinite pool of fools. By and large, the governed are foolish. Leibniz posed the notion that we live in the best of all possible worlds. And yet, what we have is a history of civilizations which have died. And therefore, how could it be the best of all possible worlds if you have many, many societies throughout history which have risen and then fallen with horrifying consequences? The challenge is how to defeat stupidity, how to put the nation and humanity on the kind of path which Ben Franklin and company succeeded in doing. I mean, this stupidity, it's crucial to think this thing through, because what we're talking about is not just oligarchical enslavement of a population by spreading false axioms, false beliefs, idiotic beliefs, like the series of things I'd referenced and many more. How about the one in the economics? All you have to do to solve the problem is cut the spending and cut the taxes. And everything will work out, because we're spending too much and taxing too much and so on and so forth. That what you have is a kind of self-enslavement within the population. That is, by and large, people controlled by such popular belief, popular stupidity, hate the independent thinker who challenges them, hate the Promethean figure. We run into this all the time on the street and in our organizing in terms of people who are challenged by LaRouche and by LaRouche's co-thinkers and associates who go after their prevailing popular beliefs. But this is, if you want a future, then a successful future, if you want to overcome the breakdown in economic life, if you want to create a society which secures a better future for young people, then it is mandatory that you break through in these axiomatic beliefs which have led to the crisis in the first place. And to do that, you have to have a conception of a future. If you're just looking one of these people that Daniel just referenced, who will go unnamed, is a senior U.S. intelligence operative going back several decades. And when he talked to Jeff Steinberg a couple of weeks ago, he said, let's assume we stop the war. However, if Obama is reelected, then this nation will not survive another year or two. What we're looking at here is a civilizational crisis which is caused not merely by the evil of oligarchism, by the evil invocation of power by this oligarchy, but by the effect of that oligarchical principle on the mind of the population. That what we're looking at is the enemy known as popular opinion. And I want to situate this discussion from the standpoint of the effect of that popular opinion on the minds of everyone in this room, perhaps to a lesser extent than the minds of the people walking by outside. But that this popular opinion, otherwise known as prevailing stupidity, is the is the enemy, is the evil which we have to overcome, which we have to reverse, which a destruction of mind has been imposed over generations. And you look at young people outside, each generation has been more and more stupid, more and more besotted with various forms of ideology which cripple the capacity to think and to act at a moment of such existential crisis. Of course, it's exactly the magnitude of this crisis which gives us the basis on which we can revolutionize the thinking of Americans and of leaders internationally in such a way that we overcome this and we have a very, very happy 21st century. Daniel referenced the Lyndon's intent and his intensifying campaign to attack the party system, which party system has been dominant in the country since Jefferson, since Jackson, and increasingly so. The nation, one could argue, and looking back, if your outlook is based on your experience and the array of sense perception, which we call experience, in your lifetime, then if you project from that, you're essentially basing your projection of the future on some array of such sense data. But what if the prevailing beliefs are leading to doom? How do you overcome that? That's the subject on the table. Now, our work as an international philosophical association, political movement, scientific movement, is paradigmatic of those leaderships historically, like that around Ben Franklin, which challenge such prevailing belief and make scientific discovery of what we call universal principle in such a way as to provide an actual leadership, the potential for cognitive breakthrough in thinking, an actual creative leap in thinking by leading individuals within that society, and then around those individuals, many others. Around, for example, the 56 men who signed the Declaration, the small circle around Franklin prior to that, who in turn propagated ideas which were truthful as against the oligarchical tyranny of that period. The paradigm for this is Prometheus. That is, what we invoke in doing this is what we'll call the Promethean principle, where you have the tyrant pagan god Zeus, prototypical of oligarchism, of this rule by the wealthy few, the rule of some powerful class which enslaves humanity. And Prometheus challenges this Zeus tyranny, the tyranny of the pagan gods, by stealing the gift of the secret of fire from those gods. Why don't you got the first slide? Oh, Daniel, why don't you, yeah. This is the classical treatment of Prometheus. There are other treatments, as in Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound. This is the Prometheus Bound of Aeschylus. Go ahead.
What I did for
and an international network of thinkers, of political fighters, which almost ended the Cold War at that point, almost created an unprecedented period of world economic development, scientific development, as the basis for peace. That is a paradigm for what Lyndon is doing with the Friday Project. That is, he has begun as of 8 days ago, last night, over the next several Fridays, addressing those individuals within the U.S. institutions, the presidency as an institution, some people in Congress, people of conscience, people of courage in this nation and internationally, to replicate at a very advanced existential crisis, to replicate the process which succeeded when Reagan announced the SDI in 1983. So you want to situate what I'll put on the table here today. You want to situate LaRouche's method of making history, LaRouche's discovery of scientific principle, within the context of this existential moment where you have a crisis that can lead imminently, as most of you know, I think, can lead imminently to thermonuclear war and thermonuclear extinction, and/or a slightly slower process of world economic and ecological holocaust. So, in that context, the enemy that we're fighting, popular opinion, prevailing belief, stupidity. For example, on the question of nuclear war, what the man in the street says is, they would never do that. That could never happen. And the question was asked to Lyndon last week at the first of these webcasts. Or on the question of the two-party system. Well, I mean, that's all there is. You know, that's the way it is. You have to choose, therefore, the lesser of evils. It's one or the other. Or you only know what you can sense. That is, knowledge is your experience. How else would you derive knowledge? And other such idiotic beliefs, but predominant prevailing beliefs which constitute the disease of the culture. Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, in his Concordancia Catholica, argued for the idea of a nation